Rabaul, New Britain, October 12, 1943, 0530 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Nakamura of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 253rd Air Group stood on the flight line at Vunakanau Airfield, watching his ground crews preparing the Mitsubishi A6M Zeros for the morning patrol, completely unaware that 107 American bombers were already approaching from the south at an altitude so low their propellers were throwing salt spray from the wave tops, carrying a weapon the Japanese military had never encountered before, the parachute-retarded fragmentation bomb that would transform their carefully prepared airfields into killing zones of shrapnel and fire. The morning mist still clung to the jungle-covered hills surrounding the airfield complex when Nakamura heard the first distant drone of engines, but he dismissed it as the sound of their own reconnaissance aircraft returning from dawn patrol, never imagining that Major John P. Henebry was leading 40 B-25 Mitchells of the U.S. Army Air Force's 3rd Attack Group directly toward Rapopo Airfield, while another formation headed for his position at Vunakanau, both groups carrying modified Douglas A-20G Havocs armed with 650 caliber machine guns in their noses and bomb bays loaded with 40 23-pound fragmentation bombs equipped with small parachutes that would allow the aircraft to escape before detonation. The concept of attacking airfields from such minimal altitude seemed impossible to Japanese military doctrine, which held that bombers required altitude for accuracy and survivability, that diving attacks were the domain of specialized dive bombers, and that horizontal bombing runs below 1,000 feet would result in the attacking aircraft being destroyed by their own bomb blasts. Yet General George Kenney of the 5th Air Force had developed these parachute-retarded weapons specifically to exploit this gap in Japanese defensive thinking, having invented the concept in the 1920s and refined it through months of practice runs against wrecked ships in Port Moresby Harbor. When the first A-20G Havoc burst over the palm trees at 200 feet, its 6 nose-mounted 50 caliber machine guns already firing, Nakamura's mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. The aircraft was so low, he could see the pilot's face through the windscreen, could read the nose art painted on the fuselage, could feel the prop wash as it roared overhead, dropping small dark objects that blossomed into parachutes, floating down toward the neat rows of parked aircraft like deadly cherry blossoms on a windless day. And in that moment he understood with crystalline clarity that everything the Imperial Navy had taught him about aerial warfare was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The first parafrag detonated among a group of Zero fighters being fueled for the morning mission, the 23 pounds of scored metal casing fragmenting into hundreds of 1-inch pieces of shrapnel that tore through aluminum skin, shattered plexiglass canopies, ruptured fuel tanks, and shredded the ground crews who had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, as the bombs continued falling in a pattern that stretched half a mile along the flight line, each explosion adding to the crescendo of destruction that transformed the orderly airfield into a scene from hell itself. Captain Yoshio Suzuki of the 251st Air Group had been walking toward his Zero when the attack began, and he threw himself flat as the first A-20G roared overhead so low that he swore he could have reached up and touched its belly, the thunderous noise of its engines mixing with the hammering of its machine guns as tracers walked across the parked aircraft, punching holes through wings and fuselages before the parafrags began their lazy descent, giving the bomber time to clear the area before the killing began in earnest, a detail that suddenly explained how the Americans could attack from such impossible altitudes without destroying themselves. The attack lasted less than 3 minutes, but in that time the carefully maintained airfields of Rabaul were transformed into burning junkyards, with over 150 Japanese aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Fuel dumps exploding in pillars of black smoke that could be seen from 50 miles away, and hundreds of irreplaceable ground crew personnel, mechanics, armorers, fuel handlers who had years of experience maintaining aircraft in tropical conditions lying dead or dying. Among the wreckage of what had been, just moments before, one of Japan's most powerful air bases in the South Pacific. Admiral Junichi Kosaka, commander of the Southeast Area Fleet at Rabaul, would later write in his diary that the morning of October 12, 1943, marked the moment when he first understood that Japan had lost control of the air war in the Pacific, not through any failure of courage or skill by Japanese pilots, but through a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Americans would choose to fight, employing tactics and weapons that seemed to violate the very principles of aerial combat as the Imperial forces understood them, turning their own airfields into death traps that could be attacked with near impunity. The genesis of this revolutionary tactic traced back to Major Paul Irving Pappy Gunn, a former U.S. Navy pilot who had been modifying aircraft in Australia since 1942, taking worn-out A-20G Havocs that had been shipped from the United States without proper armament and transforming them into low-level killing machines by installing salvaged 50-caliber machine guns from wrecked fighters into their noses, creating a concentration of forward firepower that could suppress anti-aircraft positions. While the bomber delivered its payload from altitudes that Japanese gunners had never trained to engage. Working at Charters Towers Airfield in Queensland, Australia, Gunn had convinced General Kenny that the standard bombing tactics being employed in Europe would be suicidal in the Pacific, where Japanese fighters operating from numerous island bases could intercept high-altitude formations with ease, but if they could attack from treetop level, moving too fast and too low for fighters to engage effectively, using weapons that would allow them to escape their own blast effects, they could neutralize Japanese air power on the ground where it was most vulnerable. The 23-pound and M40 fragmentation bomb that formed the core of the strategy was deceptively simple, a standard fragmentation bomb body with a scored steel case designed to break into uniform chunks upon detonation, fitted with a small parachute packed into a tube attached to the tail fin assembly, the parachute deploying automatically when the bomb was released, slowing its descent to approximately 20 feet per second, giving the attacking aircraft time to escape while ensuring the bomb would detonate among the target rather than bouncing or skipping away. Each A-20G could carry 40 of these weapons in a special honeycomb rack that Gunn had designed, nicknamed the Squirrel Cage, which stacked the bombs in 10 columns of 4, releasing them in sequence from rear to front as the aircraft passed over the target, creating a pattern of destruction that stretched for hundreds of yards, saturating the target area with thousands of pieces of shrapnel that could penetrate aircraft skin, ignite fuel, and kill personnel caught in the open with nowhere to shelter from the steel rain. The effectiveness of this tactic had been demonstrated just weeks earlier at Wewak, on the northern coast of New Guinea, where Colonel Kazuo Tanikawa of the Japanese 8th Area Army witnessed the destruction of the 4th Air Army's combat power in a series of raids from August 17 to 21, 1943, attacks so devastating that they would enter Japanese military history as one of the greatest disasters to befall their air forces during the entire Pacific War. The 4th Air Army had moved to Wewak in July 1943 to escape the range of Allied fighters based in Port Moresby, concentrating over 200 aircraft at 4 airfields: Wewak, Borum, Dagwa, but in what was believed to be a safe haven from which they could strike at Allied forces attempting to advance along the New Guinea coast. But General Kenny had secretly constructed a forward fighter base at Marilinen, hidden in the Owen Stanley Mountains, which put Wewak within range of escorting P-38 Lightnings. On the morning of August 17, 1943, Captain Toshio Yamamoto of the 14th Air Regiment was supervising the warming up of 60 aircraft at Borum when the first wave of B-24 Liberators appeared at high altitude, dropping conventional bombs that sent everyone running for cover. But this was merely a diversion for the real attack that followed 62 B-25 Mitchells and A-20 Havocs coming in at treetop height, each aircraft carrying 36 parafrags that would blanket the airfields with explosive death. Yamamoto watched in horror as the American bombers approached in perfect formation, so low that they had to pull up to clear the palm trees at the edge of the airfield, their nose guns firing continuously as they passed overhead, the sound like 1,000 hammers striking steel, and then came the parafrags, hundreds of them, floating down with deceptive gentleness before erupting in a rolling wave of explosions that seemed to go on forever, each blast sending fragments scything through aircraft, buildings, and human bodies with indiscriminate lethality. The Japanese had positioned their aircraft wingtip to wingtip along the runways to make maintenance easier, never imagining that this would make them perfect targets for parafrag attacks. And now Yamamoto watched his precious fighters Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusas, Kawasaki Ki-61 Hens, twin-engine Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryus that represented months of production from factories in Japan disappearing in balls of fire and clouds of metal fragments, some attempting to take off only to be shot down before they could gain altitude, their pilots dying in their cockpits without ever having a chance to fight back. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of the 68th Air Regiment had been preparing his Ki-48 light bomber for a mission when the attack began, and he dove under the aircraft's wing as an A-20G passed directly overhead, so close he could see oil stains on its belly, could smell the exhaust from its engines, could feel the heat from its guns as they fired, and then came the parafrags, one landing just 20 meters away, the explosion lifting him off the ground and slamming him into the bomber's landing gear, leaving him stunned and bleeding as more bombs continued to fall. turning the airfield into what he would later describe as a vision of hell that Buddha himself could not have imagined. The systematic destruction continued on August 18th, with the 3rd Attack Group assigned to hit Wewak and Borum while the 38th Bomb Group struck Dagwa and But, each bomber loaded with 12 clusters of 3 parafrags, and this time the Japanese were ready or thought they were with fighters airborne and anti-aircraft guns manned. But the low-level attack profile made their defenses almost useless, the bombers coming in too fast and too low for the fighters to engage, the anti-aircraft guns unable to depress enough to track targets passing at 200 feet. Major Takeo Shibata, commanding officer of the 26th Air Regiment, reported to Tokyo that in 4 days of attacks, the 4th Air Army had lost 174 aircraft, 54 shot down, 16 blown up on the ground, 57 badly damaged, and 47 slightly damaged, reducing their operational strength to approximately 30 aircraft, effectively eliminating them as a fighting force and opening the door for Allied advances along the New Guinea coast that would have been impossible in the face of Japanese air opposition. The psychological impact of these attacks extended far beyond the immediate tactical losses, as Japanese pilots who had prided themselves on their aggressive spirit and offensive tactics found themselves helpless against an enemy that struck without warning from altitudes they had never trained to defend against, using weapons they had never encountered, transforming their airfields from bases of operation into killing grounds where death could come at any moment from the jungle canopy, announced only by the sudden roar of engines and the chatter of machine guns. This new reality was driven home with particular force during the assault on Clark Field in the Philippines on January 7, 1945, when 3 bomb groups, the 312th, 345th, and 417th, launched a coordinated attack using A-20G Havocs and B-25 Mitchells against what had become the primary staging base for kamikaze operations intended to destroy the American invasion fleet approaching Lingayen Gulf, an attack that would demonstrate how completely the parafrag bomb had revolutionized tactical air power. In the Pacific, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of the 2nd Air Fleet, had concentrated over 400 aircraft at Clark Field and its satellite airfields, including the remaining strength of the 261st, 761st, 762nd, 752nd, and 901st Naval Air Groups, preparing for massive kamikaze attacks that would, he hoped, inflict such casualties on the American invasion force that they would be forced to reconsider their advance toward the Japanese homeland. But he had not anticipated an attack of such intensity and precision. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Matsuda of the 201st Naval Air Group was inspecting a line of Zero fighters loaded with 250-kilogram bombs for suicide missions when the first wave appeared not at high altitude as expected, but skimming the ground at 100 feet, moving so fast that the anti-aircraft gunners barely had time to react before the aircraft were overhead, their nose guns firing streams of tracers that walked across the parked aircraft like fingers of death, followed by the distinctive sight of parafrags deploying, hundreds of them, covering the field in a deadly blanket. The 312th Bombardment Group's attack was particularly devastating, with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strauss leading his A-20Gs in a line abreast formation that allowed them to cover the maximum area in a single pass, their aircraft so low that Lieutenant Bill Montgomery of the 386th Squadron later reported seeing the faces of Japanese ground crew frozen in shock as he passed overhead, their mouths open in silent screams drowned out by the roar of engines and the hammering of 50-caliber machine guns. First Lieutenant Wilbur Cleveland of the 387th Squadron was flying an A-20G nicknamed the Joker when he witnessed his squadron commander, Captain John Alsop, take a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire, the shell exploding in his bomb bay and causing the aircraft to nose up violently before bursting into flames. Yet even this loss did not stop the attack, the remaining aircraft pressing on through intense ground fire to deliver their parafrags with deadly accuracy, transforming Clark Field into what one Japanese survivor described as a burning graveyard of our Air Force. The mathematics of destruction were staggering in that single raid on January 7, 1945. The 3 American bomb groups dropped 7,836 parafrag bombs and fired over 100,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition, destroying dozens of aircraft on the ground and damaging scores more, effectively neutralizing the kamikaze threat to the Lingayen invasion force and forcing Admiral Fukudome to flee to Singapore on January 15, abandoning the Philippines to its fate. The Japanese Navy's attempts to counter these low-level attacks proved futile, as their standard defensive doctrine assumed that attacking aircraft would approach at medium to high altitude where anti-aircraft guns could engage them effectively and fighters could use their superior maneuverability to advantage, but against aircraft attacking at 200 feet, moving at 250 miles per hour, dropping weapons that delayed their detonation until the attacker was clear, traditional defensive measures were almost useless. Commander Masahiro Yamada of the 341st Naval Air Group, stationed at Tinian in the Mariana Islands, received reports of the parafrag attacks and attempted to devise countermeasures, suggesting that aircraft be dispersed widely across airfields, that revet parking areas be constructed, that dummy aircraft be used to absorb attacks, but these measures required time and resources that the Japanese no longer possessed, and even when implemented they proved only marginally effective against the saturation attacks the Americans were now capable of delivering. The tactical innovation represented by the parafrag bomb extended beyond its immediate destructive capability, fundamentally altering the dynamics of air-base suppression in ways that Japanese military planners had never anticipated, turning every forward airfield into a potential trap where aircraft concentrated for operations could be destroyed en masse before they could launch, where ground crews essential to maintaining complex aircraft in tropical conditions could be eliminated in seconds, where fuel and ammunition dumps carefully positioned for efficiency became magnets for destruction. Captain Kenji Watanabe of the Imperial Japanese Army's 5th Air Division, writing in a report that survived the war, noted that the parafrag attacks had revealed a critical vulnerability in Japanese military thinking, the assumption that courage and spirit could overcome technological disadvantage, that aggressive tactics could compensate for inferior equipment, that the warrior tradition of Japan would prevail against American material superiority. Assumptions that were proven tragically wrong. When faced with an enemy that had developed weapons and tactics specifically designed to exploit Japanese weaknesses, the development of the parafrag bomb and the low-level attack tactics that accompanied it represented a synthesis of American innovation and adaptation, combining General Kenny's pre-war invention with Pappy Gunn's field modifications, the industrial capacity to produce thousands of bombs with the training infrastructure to teach pilots how to employ them effectively, creating a weapon system that was perfectly suited to the conditions of the Pacific War where island-hopping campaigns required the rapid neutralization of enemy air power. Major Donald Hall of the 89th Squadron 3rd Attack Group had been one of the first pilots to employ parafrags in combat, leading attacks against Japanese airfields at La and Salamaua in early 1943, and he noted in his diary that the psychological effect on Japanese forces was almost as important as the physical destruction, writing that, "They simply cannot understand how we can attack from such low altitude and survive. It violates everything they believe about air combat, and you can see the confusion in their response, the way their fighters mill about unable to engage, their gunners firing wildly at targets they cannot track." This confusion was evident in Japanese after-action reports, which struggled to explain how American bombers could attack from altitudes that should have been suicidal, how they could achieve such accuracy without bomb sites, how they could saturate entire airfields with explosives without suffering catastrophic losses to their own bomb blasts. Questions that revealed a fundamental failure to understand that the Americans had not simply developed new weapons but had revolutionized the entire concept of tactical air warfare. The impact of parafrag attacks extended to Japanese strategic planning, forcing them to reconsider the deployment of their dwindling air assets, no longer able to concentrate aircraft at forward bases for offensive operations without risking their complete destruction in a single raid. Forced to disperse their forces in ways that reduced their effectiveness, required more resources for maintenance and supply, and ultimately contributed to the collapse of Japanese air power in the final year of the war. Lieutenant General Teruo Kurabayashi, preparing the defenses of Iwo Jima in late 1944, specifically cited the parafrag attacks in his decision to abandon the airfields on the island as defensive positions, recognizing that any attempt to use them for aircraft operations would simply invite devastating low-level attacks that would destroy both the aircraft and the personnel needed to operate them, a decision that fundamentally altered the battle for the island and contributed to the enormous casualties suffered by both sides. The operational history of the 312th Bombardment Group provides a clear illustration of the parafrag bomb's effectiveness, with the unit flying over 2,000 combat sorties between February 1944 and August 1945, primarily using A-20G Havocs modified with nose guns and parafrag racks, achieving a loss rate of less than 2% while destroying hundreds of Japanese aircraft on the ground, interdicting supply lines, and supporting ground operations across New Guinea and the Philippines. Technical analysis of recovered parafrag bombs by Japanese ordnance experts revealed the elegance of their design, the scored fragmentation case that ensured uniform distribution of shrapnel, the simple mechanical fuse that armed after a set number of parachute oscillations, the lightweight construction that allowed aircraft to carry large numbers without sacrificing range or performance, features that made them ideal for the kind of tactical air warfare being waged in the Pacific where targets were often concentrated and poorly defended against low-level attack. The Japanese military's inability to develop effective countermeasures to parafrag attacks reflected deeper institutional problems within their armed forces, the rivalry between the Army and Navy that prevented effective sharing of intelligence and resources, the emphasis on offensive operations that left defensive preparations neglected, the belief in spiritual superiority that discouraged acknowledgement of technological disadvantage, and the industrial limitations that prevented rapid development and deployment of new weapons systems. Colonel Ichiro Sasaki of the Army Air Force Technical Research Institute, tasked with developing defensive measures against parafrag attacks, concluded in a report dated March 1944 that the only effective counter would be to prevent the attacking aircraft from reaching their targets through aggressive fighter interception and concentrated anti-aircraft fire, but acknowledged that Japan no longer possessed the aircraft, pilots, or ammunition to implement such measures effectively, essentially admitting that they had no answer to this American innovation. The evolution of parafrag tactics throughout the war demonstrated American adaptability and learning, with early attacks sometimes suffering from premature detonation of bombs, inadequate area coverage, and occasional losses to ground fire, problems that were systematically addressed through improved fuse design, better pilot training, and refined attack formations that maximize destruction while minimizing exposure to enemy defenses, a process of continuous improvement that stood in stark contrast to Japanese tactical rigidity. Wing Commander Yoshimasa Suzuki of the 23rd Air Flotilla, observing the destruction of his unit's aircraft at Rabaul, noted that the Americans seemed to have studied Japanese operational patterns in detail, timing their attacks for moments when aircraft were most vulnerable during refueling operations, crew changes, or maintenance periods, suggesting an intelligence capability that the Japanese had severely underestimated, another factor in their inability to defend against these devastating raids. The story of Sergeant Takashi Morita, a mechanic with the 253rd Air Group who survived the October 12th attack on Rabaul, illustrates the human cost of parafrag warfare, describing how he watched his entire maintenance crewmen he had worked with for 2 years, who could diagnose engine problems by sound, who kept aircraft flying despite chronic shortages of spare parts, killed in seconds by a single parafrag that detonated among them as they worked on a Zeros engine. Their expertise and experience irreplaceable losses that hurt Japan's war effort as much as the destruction of the aircraft themselves. The strategic implications of successful parafrag attacks became clear during the Philippines campaign of 1944-1945, where American forces were able to advance with relative immunity from Japanese air attack because forward airfields had been neutralized so effectively that even kamikaze operations, which required only one-way range, became difficult to mount, forcing the Japanese to launch from bases further away with corresponding reductions in payload and effectiveness. Admiral Somu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, acknowledged in post-war interrogations that the inability to maintain effective air cover over Japanese forces in the Philippines was a direct result of American low-level bombing tactics, particularly the use of parafrags, which made it impossible to maintain operational airfields within range of critical battles, contributing directly to defeats at Leyte Gulf and the subsequent loss of the entire archipelago. The refinement of parafrag tactics reached its peak during the Okinawa campaign, where the 312th Bombardment Group, now designated as a heavy bombardment unit but still employing their proven low-level tactics, conducted raids against Japanese airfields on Formosa and the Chinese mainland, preventing the concentration of aircraft for kamikaze attacks against the invasion fleet, their A-20Gs and newly acquired B-32 Dominators delivering parafrags with such precision that Japanese commanders reported being unable to maintain more than token air operations. Major Hideaki Inaguchi, senior air staff officer for the 1st Air Fleet, wrote in his memoir that the parafrag attacks represented a form of warfare we had never imagined, turning our own concentration of force into weakness, our airfields into traps, our maintenance efficiency into vulnerability, an admission that the Japanese military had been intellectually as well as materially defeated by American innovation. The production statistics for parafrag bombs reveal the industrial dimension of this tactical revolution, with American factories producing over 500,000 M40 fragmentation bombs during the war, of which approximately 200,000 were converted to parafrag configuration, each bomb requiring precise manufacturing tolerances to ensure proper fragmentation, reliable parachute deployment, and consistent fuse timing, a mass production achievement that Japan's cottage industry approach to military manufacturing could never match. Lieutenant Colonel Selman Wells, who assumed command of the 312th Bombardment Group in March 1945, conducted a statistical analysis showing that a single A-20G carrying 40 parafrags could effectively suppress an area of approximately 15 acres, destroying or damaging any aircraft within that zone, killing or wounding exposed personnel, and creating psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate blast area, making the parafrag one of the most cost-effective weapons deployed. In the Pacific Theater, the Japanese Navy's attempts to protect their remaining aircraft through underground hangars and concealed dispersal areas, particularly evident at bases in the home islands, represented an admission that surface parking of aircraft was no longer viable in the face of parafrag attacks. But these measures required enormous labor and materials that Japan could ill afford, further reducing their ability to conduct offensive operations while increasing the strain on their collapsing economy. Captain Minoru Tanaka of the 601st Naval Air Group, one of the few Japanese pilots to survive multiple parafrag attacks on his airfield, described the experience as waiting for death from the treetops, noting that the distinctive sound of approaching A-20G engines at low altitude had become so associated with destruction that ground crews would abandon their work and run for shelter at the first hint of their approach, a Pavlovian response that significantly reduced maintenance efficiency, even when no attack materialized. The influence of parafrag tactics extended beyond the Pacific Theater, with General Kenny's innovations studied and adopted by American forces in Europe, where modified B-26 Marauders began employing similar low-level attack profiles against German airfields in France during the preparation for D-Day, though the heavier anti-aircraft defenses and more sophisticated German fighter response limited their effectiveness compared to the devastating results achieved against Japanese forces. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that parafrag attacks had destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other form of aerial combat, accounting for approximately 40% of all Japanese aircraft losses in the Pacific Theater, a statistic that underscored the importance of tactical innovation in modern warfare and validated General Kenny's pre-war theories about the vulnerability of aircraft on the ground. The last major parafrag attack of the war occurred on August 9, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, when A-20Gs of the 312th Bombardment Group struck Japanese airfields on Kyushu, destroying aircraft being held in reserve for the defense of the home islands, their crews unaware that Japan would surrender within days, their bombs falling on targets that had already become irrelevant to the war's outcome but demonstrating to the very end the devastating effectiveness of this American innovation. Commander Yoshitaka Yamamoto, one of the few senior Japanese aviation officers to survive the war, stated during interrogation that the parafrag bomb had been the assassin of our Air Force, a weapon that exploited every weakness in Japanese military doctrine and practice, from their emphasis on offensive operations that neglected base defense to their assumption that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, weaknesses that had been hidden by early victories but were ruthlessly exposed. When faced with an enemy that combined technological innovation with tactical flexibility. The legacy of the parafrag bomb extended into the post-war period, influencing the development of modern cluster munitions and low-level attack tactics that would be employed in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts, the direct descendant of General Kenny's 1920s invention and Pappy Gunn's field modifications, proof that innovation in warfare often comes not from grand strategic visions but from practical solutions to immediate tactical problems. Statistical analysis of 5th Air Force operations reveals that units equipped with parafrag-capable aircraft achieved kill ratios of over 10-to-1 when attacking Japanese airfields, compared to less than 2-to-1 for conventional bombing attacks, a differential that translated directly into American air superiority over the Pacific battlefield and enabled the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces to Japan's doorstep. The human dimension of parafrag warfare was captured in the diary of Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura, a ground crew member with the 381st Air Group who wrote on July 14, 1944, "We no longer sleep near our aircraft, the Americans come without warning, flying so low that birds scatter before them, dropping their devil bombs that float down like snow before turning our world into fire and steel. We have learned to fear the sunrise because that is when they come, always at sunrise when we are most vulnerable. The operational records of the 3rd Attack Group, preserved in the National Archives, document the evolution of parafrag tactics from experimental raids in early 1943 to refined operations by war's end, showing how pilots learned to adjust their attack profiles for different targets, how to coordinate with escorting fighters, how to minimize exposure to ground fire while maximizing weapon effectiveness, a learning curve that reflected the American military's ability to adapt and improve in combat. General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army responsible for the defense of Rabaul, acknowledged in his post-war memoir that the parafrag attacks had rendered his carefully prepared defensive positions useless, that no amount of Japanese courage could compensate for the American ability to destroy aircraft before they could take off, that the warrior tradition of Japan had met its match in American industrial efficiency and tactical innovation. The modification process that transformed standard A-20 Havocs into parafrag delivery platforms illustrated American mechanical ingenuity, with field workshops in Australia and New Guinea installing nose guns salvaged from wrecked fighters, fabricating bomb racks from scrap metal, modifying fuel systems to extend range, and reinforcing airframes to withstand the stress of high-speed low-level flight, all accomplished by mechanics working with basic tools under primitive conditions. Lieutenant Masao Sato of the 35th Air Regiment, reflecting on the destruction of his unit at Hollandia in April 1944, wrote that the parafrag attacks had revealed the fundamental miscalculation in Japanese strategic planning, the assumption that distance and terrain would protect their bases from American attack, that the vast expanses of the Pacific would work in Japan's favor, when in reality the Americans had developed weapons and tactics specifically designed to exploit the isolation of Japanese island bases. The coordination required for successful parafrag attacks demonstrated American organizational superiority, with missions involving precise timing between multiple bomb groups, fighter escorts, weather reconnaissance, rescue submarines positioned to recover downed airmen, and intelligence units providing target information, a complex orchestration that Japan's fractured command structure and inter-service rivalry could never match. Captain Richard Rogers of the 90th Squadron, 3rd Attack Group, described the technique of parafrag delivery in his combat report. You come in so low that you're looking up at the palm trees, throttles wide open, airspeed indicator showing 250, the whole aircraft shaking from the recoil of the nose guns, and at the exact moment you release the frags, counting 1001, 1002 as you clear the target area. Then the explosions start behind you and you know you've done your job. The Japanese Army Air Force's attempts to adopt similar low-level attack tactics, particularly evident in their strikes against American airfields in the Philippines during early 1942, failed to achieve comparable results because they lacked both the specialized weapons and the industrial capacity to produce them in quantity. Their pilots forced to use conventional bombs that either detonated prematurely, destroying the attacking aircraft, or bounced harmlessly away from targets. Analysis of Japanese communications intercepted by American intelligence reveals the growing desperation as parafrag attacks continued, with requests for underground hangars, concrete revetments, anti-aircraft weapons capable of engaging low-flying aircraft, and most tellingly, recommendations that aircraft be evacuated from forward bases whenever American reconnaissance planes were spotted, an admission that they could no longer defend their airfields against determined attack. The final tally of destruction achieved by parafrag-equipped units of the 5th Air Force included over 3,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground, hundreds of fuel and ammunition dumps obliterated, thousands of irreplaceable skilled personnel killed, and perhaps most importantly, the complete disruption of Japanese offensive air operations throughout the Pacific theater, achievements that validated General Kenny's belief that the air war could be won by attacking enemy aircraft where they were most vulnerable on the ground. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, whose surface forces suffered repeatedly from lack of air cover during the Philippines campaign, stated bitterly that the Imperial Navy had been betrayed by its own Air Force's inability to protect itself from American attack, not understanding that the failure was not one of courage or dedication, but of institutional inability to adapt to new forms of warfare that violated everything Japanese military tradition had taught. The story of the parafrag bomb in the Pacific War ultimately became a testament to American adaptability and innovation, the transformation of a 1920s concept into a war-winning weapon through the combination of industrial capability, mechanical ingenuity, tactical flexibility, and most importantly, the willingness to abandon conventional wisdom in favor of solutions that worked, qualities that Japan, trapped by tradition, inter-service rivalry, and industrial limitations, could never match. In the ruins of Clark Field, as Admiral Fukudome prepared to evacuate to Singapore in January 1945, he observed the burned-out wrecks of hundreds of aircraft that were to have been the divine wind to destroy the American invasion fleet, destroyed instead by an enemy that attacked from altitudes so low that Japanese military doctrine had never considered them possible, using weapons that turned their own concentration of force into fatal vulnerability. And in that moment he understood that Japan had lost not just a battle but an entire dimension of warfare it had never known existed. The legacy of those early morning raids, when A-20G Havocs burst from the jungle at 200 feet, their nose guns blazing, parafrags falling like deadly confetti across carefully lined aircraft, would resonate through military history as a demonstration that victory in war often belongs not to the side with the greater courage or superior tradition, but to those who can adapt, innovate, and exploit their enemies' blind spots with ruthless efficiency. Lessons written in fire and steel across the airfields of the Pacific.